Tony Godfrey begins his book Conceptual Art with these words: "Conceptual art is not about forms or materials, but about ideas and meanings. It questions what art is. Indeed, it could be argued that conceptual art only exists in the viewer's mental participation. This art can take a variety of forms: everyday objects, photographs, maps, videos, charts, and language itself." So that's what Tony Godfrey has to say about it. It's a fairly good setup, I think, to kick us off. The term first came into use around 1967, yet the earliest example of it was much earlier. And this is Marcel Duchamp's 1917 ready-made. Now, he called these ready-mades. You'll hear me talking about ready-mades. There's a reason why they're called ready-mades. It's because they're ready-made. And this is called the fountain. It's a urinal placed on a plinth and signed R. Mutt, as you can see. Before then, art was assumed to be either a painting or a sculpture. In point of fact, conceptual art had been around for most of the 20th century, beginning with the anti-art movement called Dada. But it was not until the late 60s that it reached its apogee, with exponents like the American Joseph Kossuth's 1 and 3 chairs. If you're wondering where the 3 chairs are, you've got a chair in the center there, you've got a photograph of the chair on the left, and on the right you've got a, you can't see it, it's too small, I know, but that's a dictionary definition of a chair. So there are your 3 chairs. Kossuth said that the purest definition of conceptual art would be that it is an inquiry into the foundations of the concept art. He later said its basic tenet is an understanding that artists work with meaning, not with shapes, colors, or materials. In the late 60s, some wit characterized it as modernism's nervous breakdown. Conceptual art generally manifests in 4 forms: the ready-made, as in the urinal, the fountain; an intervention where the subject is placed in an incongruous and surprising context; thirdly, a documentation where the subject can only be represented by notes, maps, or photographs; and fourthly, by language. Though there has never been a generally accepted definition of conceptual art, an idea or concept is the most important aspect of the work. Now here we have Duchamp sitting in front of his bicycle wheel, and incidentally, this is a replica taken from the point of view of the photograph. Now Duchamp and his ready-mades consistently put themselves forward as art while questioning what precisely art was. A point worth making here is that Duchamp started out as a cubist painting, and this is one of Duchamp's cubist paintings, nude descending a staircase. He painted that in 1912. And I think, although I make the point later in the talk, I think it needs to be remembered that all these conceptual artists started out at art colleges in various places, Goldsmiths, Slade, or in America, and so that they were all capable of producing conventional, traditional art, but they didn't do. This particular painting of Duchamp's was not well received in Paris, but when he sent it to the States, it became a succès de scandale, which at last launched him into the American spotlight. There we see it again. But it was the fountain that made the largest impact on the art world. Duchamp bought the urinal from a showroom of J.L. Mott Ironworks. He signed it R. Mutt, dated it, and entered it along with 2,000 other exhibits in an independent New York exhibition, where there was a charge of $6 per exhibit. Duchamp said later he got the idea of the name Mutt from the cartoon characters Mutt and Jeff. And Mutt and Jeff, of course, have passed into the language as Cockney rhyming slang, haven't they? From Mutt and Jeff, if you're Mutt and Jeff, you're deaf. His exhibit was, however, rejected, and Duchamp took it to the gallery of a famous photographer, Alfred Stieglitz, who was sympathetic to modern art. Its photograph was reproduced in a magazine with an editorial comment, and I quote, "Whether Mr. Mutt with his own hands made the fountain or not has no importance. He chose it. He took an ordinary article of life, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under the new title and point of view, and created a new thought for that object." End of quote. If Duchamp meant it to initiate a debate, as many believe he did, that debate is still going on today. As for the urinal itself, it disappeared soon after it was photographed. Man Ray, Duchamp's American associate, however, was happy to manufacture from ready-mades, as with this one called Gift. As you can see, it's basically a flat iron with a row of tacks glued to the center of it, so that it's no longer a flat iron, but I don't know what it is actually. It looks more like a weapon than anything else. But anyway, that was his take on conceptual art at that moment. He made it on the opening day of his first solo show in Paris. It received much attention, but disappeared at the end of the opening. This is Man Ray's The Enigma of Isidore Ducasse. It was created a year before Man Ray left for France. Basically, it's a sewing machine wrapped in an army blanket and tied with string. Isidore Ducasse, in case you're wondering, was a French poet who died at a very early age in 1870. Quite how that relates to the poet, I don't know. The original object was created and then dismantled after the photograph was taken. Ray never explained what the enigma was and intended the photograph as a riddle. His main claim to fame, of course, was as a photographer. Both Duchamp and Man Ray were affiliated to the Dada movement, which I've already mentioned, which was initiated in 1916 in Zurich, as much as satirical protest to the First World War than anything else. The movement was all but over by 1921. So rather like the earlier Fauve movement, it didn't last actually very long, but its influence was profound. The art, poetry, and performance produced by Dada artists was often satirical and nonsensical. And here we have a poster created by Raoul Haussmann. It's a collage more than anything else. And some have seen this apparently as the first wave of conceptual art. It's called the Art Critic. It's quite interesting. I've tried to work out what it says on his jacket there, but it seems to be just a name. But he's crossed it out, and there's something been stamped over the waistcoat, and that's been crossed out as well. This character on the extreme right here, this profile character, just reminds me of James Joyce. Whether it is that, I don't know, but James Joyce used to walk around Paris under a hat like something similar to that. I don't know who this lady is. But anyway, this was this poster apparently kicked it all off. In 1921, the cacodilic eye, and I think that's how you pronounce it, was presented by Francis Picabia in an effort to deconstruct conventional art. He placed a large canvas in his studio, it measures 57 by 44 inches, and simply invited visitors to sign it or add something to it, puns and doodles, etc. Now, I did look up what cacodilate means, and it's some sort of prescription that's used with eye problems. It's a chemical, from what I can see of it. What its relevance is to this poster, I don't know, but we have the eye towards the bottom of the picture, as you can see. That's the most prominent thing about the whole work of art. I nearly said work of art then. Stopped myself just in time. So there we are. Duchamp, looking back, said in 1946, Dada was an extreme protest against the physical side of painting. It was a sort of nihilism to which I am still sympathetic. It was very serviceable as a purgative. Not quite sure what he meant by that, or how serious he was when he said it. Between 1915 and 1923, Duchamp worked on this piece in New York, Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors Even. It measures over 9 feet tall by almost 6 feet wide. So it's a huge work. He created it from 2 panes of glass onto which he affixed such things as lead, foil, fuse wire, and dust. It's said it combined moments of accident with painstaking craftsmanship. He left copious notes explaining it, from which we learn he intended it to depict an erotic encounter between the bride of the upper panel and the 9 timorous bachelors gathered in the lower half. So with that thought, I'm just going to let you look at it for a moment and see if you can work out how the bride is represented in the top half. We can see a conglomeration of figures here, but I've tried to count them, and I think there are only 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So the 9th must be this character here, I suspect. I don't know. So here we have the seeds of conceptual art broadcast tentatively, and it was not until the 1960s that it became a major force in modern art. However, before that, we do have Robert Rauschenberg's collaboration with Wilhelm de Kooning in 1953, intending to make an artwork in reverse. This is called Erased de Kooning drawing. De Kooning gave him a heavily worked drawing, which Rauschenberg proceeded to erase. It took him 6 weeks to do it. So I'll let you absorb the concept of that. Why would it take him 6 weeks? I don't know. It's not particularly big. It's 19 by 14. And you can just about see the original drawing underneath it. Though what it represented, that's difficult to say. In 1960, Iris Sert asked 41 artists to produce her portrait for her gallery, And this was Armand's contribution, born Armand Fernandez, portrait of Iris Saet, 1960. It's a collection of things she'd worn. And as you can see there, they seem to be squashed behind the perspex window, fitted to some sort of box, I suppose, very, very shallow box. Rauschenberg's contribution to the gallery was a telegram, simply saying, "This is a portrait of Iris Saet, if I say so." We are now in the realms of the neo-dada, especially when we consider Daniel Spurer's table portraits. This is one of, these two are one of many that he produced. Whatever, the idea behind this was whatever was left on the table at the end of any particular meal, he fixed to a board, turned it through 90 degrees and hung it on the wall. The idea, according to the artist, was to find aesthetic value in the way diners unconsciously arranged things, or rearranged things would be more accurately, I think. So we've got two tables of food or of a meal shared by people, and this is how they when they got up from the table at the end of the meal, this is how the table was left. So somehow Daniel Spurey, he managed to transfix these items, these saucers and cups and spoons, and I suppose he glued them on, must have done really, onto the board, and so that they could be presented like this. I have to smile when I can see the idea was to find aesthetic value in the way diners unconsciously arranged things. While you're looking at that, in 1959, Piero Manzoni came up with several iconoclastic concepts, one of which was to draw lines on sheets of paper, roll them up, and seal them in boxes. On each box, he wrote the length of the line, the date, and signed it. His idea was that if the seal was broken, the box ceased to be art. I think the shades of Schrödinger's cat in this. Each box sold for $30. At an exhibition in Copenhagen, he also boiled eggs and stamped each with his thumbprint. He then invited those present to eat the eggs so that within 70 minutes, the entire exhibition had been consumed. Clearly, there are no images relating to either of these two works, which is emphasizes a fundamental problem with some of conceptual art. It was probably not until the 60s that conceptual art finally broke free from the way society viewed traditional art. A new wave of artists presented themselves not simply as experimental, but as alternative. Marcel Duchamp was still around at the age of 76, though for the last 30 years, he devoted his life to playing chess rather than producing art. From 1963, the American Ed Kienholz began to produce what he called concept tableaus, which gave instructions for a commission. So the idea behind this was that the purchaser would first of all buy the concept with his first installment. Then if he liked it, he'd pay for the drawing of the work. And then if he still liked it, with a larger final third payment, he would pay for the work to be made. And this was one such work. And as you can see from the top, it's huge. It's 32 feet long, 10 feet tall, and 8 feet deep, I would imagine. It consisted of plaster casts, posters, fiberglass, furniture, photographs, a Coca-Cola machine, and a stuffed dog. I'm still looking for the stuffed dog. I think it might be here. I'm not rushing through these because I'm giving you a chance to take them in. In 1961, Kleis Oldenburg in New York created the store. There he is, sitting in front of his store, which simulated the way consumer culture presented objects for sale. As a busy parody of art commerce, he opened a storefront on the Lower East Side of Manhattan from where he sold to the public. But these were not ready-mades, they were actually plaster replicas. It said his interest lay in exposing the grey area between art and commodity while expressing the role of the artist as self-promoter. No agent was necessary, of course, and therefore no agent fees had to be paid. We're not told how successful this shop front was, how much whether he sold many of the items or not. I don't think that would have been important to him. It was creating the actual concept was what was important. It may not have been possible to buy, I don't know. In the 60s, new movements or isms sprang up with monotonous regularity. Most were short-lived, with perhaps the exception of minimalism. Carl Andre's equivalent series consists of a rectangular arrangement of 120 fire bricks in various combinations. Although the shape of each sculpture is different, they all have the same height, mass, and volume, and in a sense, are therefore equivalent to each other, hence the name. It was said such minimalist works represented an experience which begins as a concept in the artist's head and culminates inside the viewer's head in the form of self-reflection. Sounds very pretentious to me. The exhibition catalogue, where the bricks were first exhibited, said of Andre, "If someone says his work is art, it's art." I think we can all remember in the mid-60s this Carl Andre's bricks causing quite a stir, especially in the national press. The heyday of conceptual art is usually seen as the period between 1966 and 1972. Photography became necessary to capture these works, as in A Line Made by Walking England by Richard Long. It documents a walk back and forth across a park until the grass is trodden into an evident line. Long claimed it makes one think about one's relationship to the world. It's the act of walking which constitutes the artwork, though the photograph was obviously necessary to document it, and it could then be sold. This emphasis on process as a reaction to conventional art is also exemplified by Robert Smithson's Asphalt Rundown. In a quarry outside Rome, Smithson arranged for hot asphalt to be poured down a steep embankment so that it cooled and hardened as it fell. The resulting sculpture, he claimed, could be seen as frozen time. Try and get that exhibit into a gallery or exhibition space. Isn't it all getting a little bit silly now? Some artists wanted to dematerialize the art object and present it verbally. Dan Graham's March the 31st, 1966 is a good example of this. This word art, he called it word art, begins with an unimaginable distance and ends inside the eye. There is nothing here but concept, but is this art? The most famous of these dematerialized exhibitions was Robert Barry's 1969 show in Amsterdam, where he pinned to the front door a sign saying, "During the exhibition, the gallery will be closed." There was no work on show, not even a room where work could be seen. All that the artist presented was the fact that an exhibition was going on, although, of course, it wasn't. In the same year in Rome, Yanis Kournelis exhibited 12 live horses in the Galleria Latico. By all accounts, this was an extraordinary sensory experience. The idea was that the horse smell, dung, urine, hay, etc., plus the clatter of hooves on the floor, all created a sense of claustrophobia. This sort of exhibit raised interesting questions about collecting conceptual art and displaying them in exhibitions. Half a Room is a 1967 conceptual artwork by the Japanese artist Yoko Ono. The work is made from various objects cut in half and painted white. The piece was first displayed at the Leicester Gallery in London, and the cost of the installation was underwritten by, yes, you guessed it, John Lennon. She described the artwork as a response to the half-empty space in my life as a result of her estrangement from her second husband, Anthony Cox. Apparently, Ono awoke one day and noticed that he had not returned from a night out, and so the bed was half empty. Few museums were willing to stage the live horses, or indeed something like Paolini's Apotheosis of Homer. Assembled music stands supporting photographs of historical figures as played by famous actors, i.e. Jack Palance as Attila the Hun, Richard Harris as Oliver Cromwell, Flora Robson as Elizabeth I, and so on. I leave you to try and work out what that has to do with Homer, but I'm sure there must be some connection. If only in Paolini's mind. In the 1970s, conceptual artists were becoming more interested in refinement and minimalism. Michael Craig Martin's Oak Tree consisted of a glass shelf placed 9 feet high on a wall with a glass of water on it. It was the only exhibit in the Rowan Gallery in London. A plaque beneath, and here's the plaque, as you can see there. The plaque beneath consisted of a series of questions and answers, as though somebody was interrogating the artist. Questions and answers like, to begin with, would you describe the work? Yes, of course, says the artist. What I've done is change a glass of water into a full-grown oak tree. One could call it anything one wished, but that would not alter the fact it is an oak tree. And another question on that plaque. Do you consider that changing the glass of water into an oak tree constitutes an artwork? To which his answer is apparently yes. From 1972 to 76, the American-born Susan Hiller worked on a project entitled Dedicated to Unknown Artists, which consisted of 300 postcards of British seaside resorts, each with the title Rough Sea. Accompanying them was a set of notes recording Hiller's reaction and musings and a map. So you can see them more close up. The exhibit in its entirety is in the corner there of the Tate, and I've underimposed a close-up. I'm sure you've all seen these postcards on your travels. Accompanying them was a set of notes recording Hiller's reactions and musings and a map, as I've said. A debate was thus instigated. Is she an artist or a curator? Hiller herself says the work was designed as an exhibition piece with myself in the role of curator, collaborating with, extending the work of the unknown artists who created the Rough Sea set of postcards. To which the Tate adds, the title identifies the work as a tribute to the overlooked and forgotten artists who painted, photographed, or hand-tinted the numerous seaside images in the postcards she collected. By making such commonplace objects the subject of a dedicated and extensive presentation, Hiller gives new status to the word mundane. In the 1990s, the term conceptual came to stand for way out or even crazy, as well as for showmanship, which the earlier generation of artists had ostensibly avoided. It seemed that outrage was being deliberately evoked in the public at large in order to get media attention. Damien Hirst's formaldehyde sculptures, for instance. This one is Shark, which I'm sure will be familiar to all of you. Also entitled The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living. The work was funded by Charles Saatchi at a cost of £50,000. The tiger shark was caught off Queensland in Australia, specifically for this artwork. Hirst wanted something big enough to eat a man. It was first exhibited in 1992 in the first Young British Artists show at the Saatchi Gallery. I'm sure some of you will tell me later that you went to that show. Saatchi had the last laugh, if you'll forgive me saying it. So he sold the work in 2004 for an estimated £8 million. Charles Saatchi, of course, was a huge player in the art of the period, collecting almost randomly the work of young artists newly out of art school, whether from Slade or Goldsmith, and who are often struggling with poverty, the ability to rent studio space, and who might never have otherwise been recognized. If Saatchi came along and bought your work, you were made. Saatchi's show also featured Hirst's artwork 1,000 Years. In one half is a severed cow's head, and you can just about make it out there, with an insect zapping light, there's the insect zapping light, suspended above it, while the other half contains a large white dye with just one dot on every face. Maggots released into the cage-like container fed off the cow's head and became momentary flies before inevitably ending their lives on the electrocuting light. Behind the shark is on the extreme left there, and on the right we can also see another exhibit, a lamb cut in half. Well, you can't see that it's cut in half there, but we know it is cut in half. Another controversial work was Rachel Whiteread's Ghost House, 1991 to 93. Now this was a whole house. This was an actual house. It's got an address, or it had an address, 193 Grove Road, Bow in North London. She filled it with concrete, and then the walls and windows and glass and whatever, they were peeled away, so that what you were left with was actually the space, the interior space of the house, which constituted the sculpture. It won the Turner Prize, but stood for barely 3 months before the council ordered it to be demolished. Its impact on British art was immense. In America during the 80s, Jeff Koons had been making packaging an art. His ready-mades with desirable consumer goods, like the new Hoover convertible, and his work featured a series of vacuum cleaners from popular brand names which appealed to Koons. The salient feature of each artwork in what he called the new series was the fluorescent lighting, which gave them a gleaming, pristine appeal. As you can see, the Tate share this exhibit with its galleries in Scotland, with Scottish. It hasn't got any galleries in Scotland, but the Scottish galleries. So there are ready-mades again, just as Duchamp started the whole thing off in 1917. But these, of course, are pristine new models. You could actually use them. They haven't been made by Jeff Koons. They've simply been presented by Jeff Koons under this fluorescent lighting and behind perspex, encased in perspex boxes. Was he mocking society for its fascination with new things? I don't know. In the 1990s, the Cuban-born minimalist Felix Gonzalez Torres came up with yet another slant on conceptual art. This hasn't got a title, as you can see. Here we have an endless supply of wrapped sweets in piles where the artwork was intended to be completed by the gallery visitor picking up a sweet, unwrapping it, and eating it. The museum staff would top up the stack each morning. His two identical battery-powered clocks, entitled Perfect Lovers, were initially set to precisely the same time, but inevitably they fell out of sync as time passed. This loss of connection appears to be the work's message. The pale blue paint of the wall behind was, according to the artist, the colour of a beautiful memory. Like much of his work, he transformed everyday objects into meditations on love and loss. It was created shortly, this particular exhibit was created shortly after his partner was diagnosed with AIDS, and Torres himself died of AIDS some time later. In the same year, a homage to Duchamp, or homage to Duchamp, I'm never quite sure how to pronounce that word, the father of conceptual art, was completed by the American Sherry Levine with her version of his fountain in gleaming cast bronze. I think one's tempted to ask why. In the following year, a Thai artist, Rikrit Theravaniadi, I struggle with these words. Rikrit Theravaniya, but all the things he found in the storeroom and office of the Gallery 303 in New York, he put them into the main body of the gallery itself, including the gallery's director, who was forced to work in public view. So everything from the office has been piled into the gallery space there. And presumably the storeroom is at this point simply empty, although we don't see the director sitting there at the table working in this particular photograph. Meanwhile, in the storeroom, here we have the storeroom on the right there. In the storeroom, he cooked curries for the gallery visitors, and the leftovers, kitchen utensils, and used food packets became the art whenever he was not there himself. So when he was there, it wasn't art, but when he wasn't there, it was art. In 1992, Simon Patterson reproduced the London Underground map, calling it the Great Bear, as a mounted lithograph in an aluminium frame. He renamed the different lines after philosophers, footballers, saints, comedians, actors, etc. Patterson is quoted saying, "I like disrupting something people take as read. I am not simply pulling the rug out from under people. What interests me is juxtaposing different paths of knowledge to form more than the sum of their parts." So there we have on the left the exhibit in its entirety, and there is a close-up of part of it, and you can readily read names like Phil Silvers, Gina Lollobrigida, Googie Withers, Kirk Douglas, Jean-Paul Sartre, quite an eclectic mix of Oliver Reed is even down there, just below Laurence Olivier. So it's quite an eclectic mix of, though there was some, I think there was some logic behind the way these names were put on the map, which related to the actual lines that, that they found themselves pinned to. In 1997, there was the notorious Sensation exhibition at the Royal Academy, featuring the work of the young British artists from the Saatchi collection. It shocked the art world. Besides Damien Hirst's Shark, which we've already seen, there was Self, Mark Quinn's self-portrait made from his own frozen blood. And perhaps even more controversially, and I'm sure you'll remember this, Marcus Harvey's portrayal of the serial killer Myra Hindley, which he entitled Myra. The work measured 9 by 11 feet. The effect is of a black and white mugshot photograph as printed in a newspaper. It was made using casts of infants' hands to build up a mosaic. Countless protests and resignations followed. Windows at Burlington House were smashed and the painting was vandalized twice. Saatchi later sold it for an estimated £100,000. Another exhibit was Sarah Lucas's Au Naturel, which sought to challenge our traditional views of sexuality, gender, and identity. Her work, obsessed with genitalia, communicates through weird and almost childlike compositions and frankness. A lot of her work is very similar to this. I went to an exhibition in Whitechapel of her work, and it was all the exhibits pretty well were these almost, I don't know, playground humor, really. Very similar to this. Mask, sorry, let me go back to Mask, right, Mask, there you are. Mask, over 5 feet tall, is by the Australian artist Ron Muir, best known for his extraordinarily lifelike sculptures which experiment with scale. Very stern-looking individual. Would frighten any child, I should think, especially on this being over 5 foot high. Not in the exhibition, though she did exhibit, is Tracy Emin's My Bed. I quote from the Tate catalogue: "The idea for My Bed was inspired by a sexual yet depressive phase in the artist's life when she had remained in bed for 4 days without eating or drinking anything but alcohol. When she looked at the vile, repulsive mess that had accumulated in her room, she suddenly realized what she had created." Now, I've seen this exhibit in the Tate, and you can actually, when I saw it, you could actually almost walk right up to it, and there was a certain temptation to tidy it up, but that was coupled with a repulsion at touching anything. Saatchi had the last laugh. He bought it for £150,000, presumably off the artist, and then sold it in 2014 for a little over £2.5 million. So I think most of us will be looking at our unmade beds each morning in a new way now. This is another exhibit that I've got personal experience of. Shibboleth by Dolores Salcedo, a Colombian artist, took the form of a long crack in the floor of the turbine room at Tate Modern. The crack was made by opening up the floor and then inserting a cast from a Colombian rock face. A Tate spokesman said, "She's not specifying how it's been done. What she wants is for people to think about what's real and what's not." Shibboleths, of course, derive from the Hebrew and have been used by many societies as passwords or a simple means of self-identification, signaling affinity to some group or another. Now, the photograph on the right is one I took myself, and I must admit I was totally confused as how she'd achieved that, because there was definitely a crack that you could have put your hand into quite simply. I could only assume that somehow they'd raised the floor, but it sounded a massive undertaking if they had it, a huge cost as well. So you could see that I think I seem to remember that the crack starts at the entrance there, and it was a natural crack at the entrance for a short distance, and then it was extended by the artist, created by the artist, though of course it's not a crack in the floor. Actually, it's an illusion. Shooting the Corner was a controversial exhibit by Anish Kapoor, winner of the 1991 Turner Prize at the Royal Academy in 2008-9. It consisted of firing red wax mixed with paint from a pneumatic cannon through a series of openings. There's the cannon. And that's the result of the cannon firing it down this length. Of course, it's got these archways separating the various gallery rooms, so it's lent itself to the idea, I suppose. Kapoor described it as very violent and deeply phallic. Echoes of violence, ejaculation, and menstruation are undeniable. I was at the time, I must admit, I did think about in terms of when this exhibit was done with, how on earth did they clear all this mess up? The London Mastaba was a temporary floating installation exhibited in the Serpentine in London, on the Serpentine, I should say, in London in 2018 by Christo and Jean-Claude. A mastaba is a flat-roofed Egyptian tomb with sloping sides. It's also a Mesopotamian bench, apparently. It consisted of over 7,000 oil barrels and sat on a floating platform of high-density polythene held in place by 32 anchors, and it was 66 feet tall. I don't remember seeing this at any time. Well, 2018, it was just before COVID, so I didn't go down to London in that particular year. But at what cost? At what cost to produce this work? Now we come to one conceptual artwork which absolutely blew me away when I did see it. This is Bill Viola's 5 Angels for the Millennium, 2001, in Tate Modern. It's not there now. It's an installation comprising videos projected on a large scale directly onto the walls of a dark gallery space. Now, it's very difficult. You can see videos of this on YouTube. This is obviously just a still, but I think it's best that I can describe what it was like to be in that room and see these videos, because the first thing you saw on the wall was nothing, just black. And then you saw a bubble at the bottom, the beginning of the splash, basically. So what Viola did was got somebody, this person here, on this particular instance, to dive into a pool of water. He captured the dive, the splash, the effect on the water, and from under the water, obviously, and then he reversed it. And this was the point. He reversed it so that you just saw the bubble, and then the bubble became bigger and bigger, and then you saw this image, and then ascending, and then all this was created, and then this huge splash that suddenly came manifest. And so it was almost like an angel being born, really. And this was accompanied, each projection was accompanied by an individual audio track featuring underwater noises that gradually reached a crescendo that culminated in a sudden explosion of light and sound as the angel emerged from the water. And I have to say, it was the most amazing experience and it may be that some of you others had the chance to see it in 2001. It'll certainly stay with me for the rest of my life. And finally, you'll perhaps be glad to know, and finally, At Fault by Carla Black in 2011, this is a large floor-based sculpture created by making large quantities of crumpled sugar paper billow across the floor. The paper is covered in different pastel shades, suggesting a certain tweeness. On the floor, chalked surfaces merge with scattered powder paint, so that the viewer is unsure whether the sculpture begins and ends. The Tate claims, and I quote, "The work oscillates between materiality and immateriality." So, big intake of breath. There we have a glimpse of some significant examples of conceptual art, which I hope demonstrate its diversity and range. Along the way, we're encouraged to believe that the motivating force, if unwitting, was to ask the as yet unanswered question, what constitutes art? It should be remembered that these conceptual artists, and I think I mentioned this at the beginning of the talk, these conceptual artists were mostly traditionally trained at art school and would have no doubt produced conventional landscapes and portraits with considerable flair and originality. Think of Duchamp's Cubist painting that I showed right at the beginning. However, they chose not to do so, but to rock the establishment with their often outrageous and unique creations. Not only the establishment, but the usual gallery viewer. In other words, you and I.